Hello and welcome to Creating Disciples with me, Austin Roberts. We are so excited and happy that you are joining us today because we are going to be looking at one of the 7 churches in Revelation. So we hope you're ready for that and we hope you enjoy it. And thank you for being with us today. Have you ever been in a place where the legalism just takes all the joy out of following the rules? Do you know what I mean when I say that? Have you ever been somewhere where the rules are so stringent and strict that there is just no joy? Well, when I was in college, I used to work as an RA, a resident assistant in the men's dorm. And every week, we would have a big meeting on Wednesday. We would have a meeting with the men and the women's dorms, RAs and deans and so forth. And we liked doing that. We liked being there with the girls' RAs and talking to them about how things were going for them and so forth. And one of the things we did from time to time was we used to compare. We used to compare how the rules were and how they were applied and so on. Well, the rules were pretty similar. Depending on your class standing, you probably had a curfew that was between midnight and 2 a.m. And there were other things, you couldn't ride your bikes or your longboards in the dorm halls. You weren't allowed to have weapons in your room. You weren't allowed to have alcohol, all those kinds of different things. And the rules were similar. But there was a difference. You see, in the way the rules were applied in the men's and women's dorms, there was a bit of a difference. You see, if your curfew was midnight, 12 a.m., as a guy, and you were to come in at like 12:05 a.m., you would probably be all right. The dean would look at you and be like, let's try to be on time next time, and it would be fine. But at the girls' dorm, things were different. You see, apparently, you could come in at 12:01 a.m., and you would have consequences for being 1 minute late. And those consequences were swift and severe. You could get put on probation, you could get your curfew reduced, all kinds of different things might happen to you. Have you ever been in a situation like that? Where the legalism is so great that there is just no joy in following the rules? I don't know if you've been there, but I've been there before, and it's tough. You don't want to be in a place where the rules are so strict that things just aren't fun. Well, I remember another time when my girlfriend, Nicole, who is now my wife, was visiting me. I lived in San Jose, and she was there for a visit. And on a Saturday night, we went out to see a hockey game between the Dallas Stars and the San Jose Sharks. Well, we had a good time. We enjoyed the game. And when it was done, we got in the car and headed back to my apartment. Well, on the way back, we were driving and we were talking and we were having a wonderful time, and I was driving there. And as I was doing so, something happened. I was driving there and I noticed something that was not good. I noticed the lights and the sound in my rear view mirrors, and I thought, oh boy, I'm going to be in trouble now. And as I noticed that, I looked down at my speedometer and I thought, oh, I'm going to be about $400 poorer here in 10 minutes or so. So I did what I had to do. The police pulled me over, so I got over to the side of the road. I parked there, rolled the window down, and waited for the officer to come up and talk to me. Well, there he came, and he said, do you know why I pulled you over today? And I kind of mumbled something, and I knew why he'd pulled me over, and I don't remember what I said. But he said, okay, license and registration, please. So I gave him my driver's license, I gave him my car registration, and all that good stuff. And there he was, and he was looking at my things. And he went back to his patrol car, and I'm sure he wrote some things down, checked to make sure my license was valid, my insurance was good, and the registration was good, and all that kind of stuff. And then he came back to the car, and he started talking to me a little bit. And he asked me again, do you know why I pulled you over? And I again kind of mumbled something, and then he said something that really got me. He was like, well, I was driving in the lane immediately to your right, and you passed me. And when you passed me, I looked down at my speedometer, and I saw that I was going 74 miles an hour. And at that moment, I was like, oh, man, I'm definitely going to be in trouble now. And I was like, oh, I'm sorry, yeah, I was going too fast. I wasn't paying attention. I was talking to my girlfriend, and I just wasn't watching. And then he asked what we'd been doing, and I told him, oh, we just came from the hockey game. And he asked where we were going, and I said, well, I'm just headed back to my place. And he asked, well, did you have anything to drink tonight? And I said, no, I don't drink, actually. And I wasn't sure if he believed me or not, but he sat there and kind of looked at me for a second. And finally, he said some words that I will never forget. He said, well, I'm going to let you off on a warning this time. And by the way, your taillight's out, so make sure to get that fixed. And I was so relieved. And I thought, I will never, ever again speed in my entire life. Have you ever been in a situation where the rules are so strict that it just takes the joy out of following them? Or perhaps a situation like that where somebody has the right to give you consequences but just lets you off and says, well, why don't we try to do better next time? I've been in both of those situations, and I can tell you which one of those is more enjoyable. Well, if you ever have been in a place where things are very legalistic and the rules must be followed at all costs, perhaps you are familiar with the context into which we will step today. You see, we're going to open back up to the book of Revelation, to the 2nd chapter. There are 7 churches here in the 2nd and 3rd chapters, and we're going to look at that first church, the church in Ephesus. But before we read what the text says, what was written, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Ephesian church and about the city of Ephesus. You see, the city of Ephesus during this period of history was a very, very important city. It had a huge trade route going through it, and it also had a port. It was right there on the ocean. So this was a very diverse city. People came from all over the world to visit Ephesus, and not only that, it had a big temple to Artemis with many, many priestesses who also doubled as temple prostitutes. And so it was an important city in the Roman Empire, and it had this designation. You see, the city of Ephesus was a free city in the Roman Empire, which was rare. Very few cities had it, but Ephesus did. And basically what that meant was that Ephesus had the ability to govern themselves. And that's important, because if you are in the Roman Empire, you are under the foot of Rome. But Ephesus could govern themselves, and that was a big deal to them. Now, there are also Christians in that city, and they followed Christ, and they did a good job at it, as we will see here in the text in just a couple of moments. And so that's the context into which we step. We have this big city. It's probably an immoral city. It's easy to get in trouble. It's easy to sin. It's easy to do things that are not becoming of followers of Christ. But it's an important city. There's a lot to do. And Jesus is going to say some things to this city in the book of Revelation. God's going to say some things. So let's read. We're going to read verses 1 to 3, and then 6 and 7. And we'll go back to the middle portion, verses 4 and 5, in a few minutes. So let's start. To the angel of the church in Ephesus write, these are the words of him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand and walks among the 7 golden lampstands. I know your deeds, your hard work, and your perseverance. I know that you cannot tolerate wicked people, that you have tested those who claim to be apostles but are not, and have never found them false. You have persevered and have endured hardships for my name, and yet not grown weary. So now we skip down to verse 6. But you have this in your favor. You hate the practice of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who is victorious, I will give the right to eat from the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. So this letter begins by saying some great things. Jesus says to this church, you have followed the rules and you have followed them well. When it comes to morality and doing good things, you're basically faultless. You've done what I've asked you to do. You've kept out the false teachers and the prophets. You hate the Nicolaitans, who I also hate. There are some good things said about this church. And think about it. Think about in your own church as an example. If Jesus today were to walk into your church and everyone was to be sitting there, everyone who comes to your church, and he were to walk up to the stage, the pulpit, and look out to the church, to everyone who is there, and say this, to all of you who are here, you are following the rules of as I have laid them out. You are good and moral people. You've kept out the wrong doctrine and false prophets and evildoers. And you're good people. You hate the practices that I hate. And so let everybody hear that this church, your church, is a good church. You would feel good about that. I would feel good about that if Jesus were to say that about my own church. And in fact, the truth is, don't we all kind of strive for that a little bit? Isn't it great when it is said of us that we are following the rules and we're doing it right? We all kind of want that in our lives, don't we? And that is what Jesus says to this church. That's what he says here. He says, you are a beacon of light in a dark world. When people look upon you, you shine bright. Well, that's a wonderful thing to hear. I don't know if you have ever seen a film by the title of The Finest Hours, but I have. And the film is the story of the most dangerous U.S. Coast Guard rescue mission ever. It takes place in Massachusetts in February. It is winter, and as you can imagine, winter in the northeastern part of the United States is cold, and it is stormy, and it is below freezing. There is snow and ice everywhere. It is not a nice place to think about living over the winter time, at least. But that's where this story happens. And as the story goes, there was a ship off the coast of Massachusetts that had gotten into a shipwreck. And the shipwreck was so bad that this ship, the USS Pendleton, I believe, had split in half, and they were in trouble. One half of the ship had already sunk, and the other half was going to follow that quickly. Well, on the shore, the U.S. Coast Guard decided that they needed to do something, but it was dangerous. And so they talked and they got together and they decided finally that they were going to send Bernie Weber, one of the new men there, to go out with a couple of the other guys and rescue the guys on this ship. And the truth is that this mission was really a suicide mission. The likelihood that they would come back alive, the three of them that were going, let alone the other 32 or 33 men on the ship, was probably not going to happen. It was a dark night. It was a stormy night. It was a dangerous situation. But Bernie Weber, on his little boat meant for 12 people, went out nonetheless. And so there are these three guys. They're on this boat. They're headed out to find this shipwreck. Well, as they did so, they had to cross a sandbar that was kind of out there a little ways out in the water. And according to the story, this sandbar would have been dangerous to cross even in good conditions, let alone the conditions that they were in that night. And he had to time it just right, but they got out there that evening and they had to wait for a wave before it would crash so it wouldn't capsize them and wait before it got too big. And they went and they crashed directly into that wave and made it through. In the process, however, they lost their compass, which was ever so important in guiding them to their destination at the shipwreck and then back home. But somehow, by the grace of God himself, they found the shipwreck. And there were the men hanging on for dear life, and they loaded safely 32 out of the 33 men, only one perished, onto that boat meant for 12. And then they had nothing else to do but to turn around and head home. So that's what Weber did. He turned that little boat around and headed for shore. But they were in trouble. They had lost their compass. It was dark, it was stormy, and they did not know where they were going. But he went, and he went for what seemed like hours on end, headed for a shore that he didn't know where it was. But they continued on. And finally, after what must have seemed like an eternity to them and the people on the shore, someone had an idea. You see, someone on shore thought these men are never going to make it back home if they can't see the shore. They might be dead already, but let's do something. And so all the people on the shore lined their cars up on the shore and turned the headlights on. So suddenly, in a night that was oh so dark, there was a beacon of light, a beacon of hope. And Weber and the many men on his small boat made it home in an incredible show of strength and courage. And by the grace of God himself, they survived. Only because of a beacon of light in a dark and dangerous night. And that's why Jesus praises the Ephesian church here. He says, basically, you're a beacon of light in a dark night. A place that is difficult for people to see. When they look at you, they see something good. They see something moral. They see something that they should also be doing. And so the Ephesian church is praised for that. The truth is, however, the story doesn't quite end there. There are a couple more verses, if you remember, that we haven't read yet. So let's read them together and see what is said to this church. Those are verses 4 and 5. And the text says this: "Yet I hold this against you. You have forsaken the love you had at first. Consider how far you have fallen. Repent and do the things that you did at first. If you do not repent, I will come to you and remove your lampstand from its place." Ooh, that is harsh. Jesus is saying, repent, or I'm going to take your lampstand away. I'm going to remove your church altogether. That's a harsh thing to think about. You see, the Ephesian church was struggling with a problem, one that you may in fact be familiar with. They were a church without love. They were a church that was legalistic, that was strict, and that was cold. Have you ever been in a place like that? A place where following the rules that are so strict just takes the joy out of doing it? Well, that's the situation that the Ephesian church was in. And maybe you're in a similar situation. But Jesus says something interesting. He says there is a remedy and a solution. There are some things you can do to change that. 3 things, in fact. And if you look at the text, the first thing he says is this. He says, remember. He says, remember how it was before. Remember how it was when you first became Christians and were excited about following Jesus. Remember that feeling you had. In fact, you may have felt something similar at some point in your own life. Remember that first girlfriend or boyfriend you had. Remember that first love. Remember those feelings of butterflies and flowers. Remember how it was. And that's what Jesus is saying here. He's saying, remember that feeling. Even though it may seem far away and a long time in the past, remember what that was like? Remember how it was? And so he's saying, remember. Parents may be familiar with this feeling. Remember your first child. The first child that came into this world, and it changed your life. And for this child, you know what you would do? You disinfected everything. You sold the dog. You wouldn't let people within 10 feet of that child in case they were sick. Remember that feeling? And then by the time the 4th child comes along, it's like, well, that dirt he's eating will build immunity anyway. And Jesus is saying, remember. Remember how it was at first, when you first started following me. And that's the first thing he tells them. He tells them to remember. And that's important, to remember how it was at first. But then there's a second thing. The second thing he says is to repent of their ways. And if we go back and look at the original language in which this letter was written, the original Greek, the word that is used there is metanoeo. And if we literally translate that word means to turn around. So what Jesus is basically saying is he is saying this. He's saying you are facing one direction, and I need you to turn around 180 degrees and face the other direction. That's what he's saying by repenting. He's saying change what you're doing, change it all the way around, and face the other way. When I was in college, one of the very first classes I took struck a deep lesson with me. It was one of our very first, it was the very first ministry class taught by Dr. Paul Dibdahl. And I remember one day in class, he made this example about people who were following Christ. He went to the whiteboard and he drew a cross. He drew a cross there on the whiteboard. And then surrounding that cross, he just put many different dots around it. And he said each one of these dots represents a person. And some of the dots were very close to the cross, and others were very far away from the cross. And then he did something interesting. You see, with many of those dots, he put arrows by the dots. And he connected them, and some of the arrows pointed toward the cross, and some of the arrows pointed away from the cross. And he said, listen, the truth is that in your life, it doesn't really matter how close or how far away you are from the cross. What really matters is which direction you're facing. Even if you are very, very far away from the cross, if you are facing toward the cross, if you're headed that direction, you're in good shape. But you could be right next to the cross, and you could have turned your back on it, and you're going away. And that's not good. So the truth is, it doesn't matter how close you are, but you must face the cross. You must head toward the cross. And that's kind of what Jesus is telling the people here. He's saying, you are oh so close to the cross, but you're facing the wrong direction. You need to repent. You need to turn around. You need to face the cross. And that is an important lesson and a difficult lesson to learn sometimes. We might be right there. We might be oh so close. But if we're looking the wrong way, doesn't matter. What's the point? We could be so far away, but as long as we're headed the right way, we're in good shape. And that is what they're talking about here. That's what Jesus is talking about here. He's saying face the cross. So first he said, remember. Remember how it was at first, when you first started following me. Remember that feeling of excitement and of passion of following Jesus, of being part of the church. And then repent. Repent of what you have become. Face the cross. Stop going the wrong direction, but turn and face Jesus. And then there is a third thing. And it's a little harder to catch, but this is what he says. He says, do the things you did at first. And so basically he's saying, return what is important to the top. He's saying, remember to prioritize things effectively. Remember to prioritize love as the number one thing. Keep the main thing the main thing. And all the other things are important. I'm not saying to let go of those entirely, because you shouldn't. You've done a good job. You've been moral. But keep the main thing as the main thing, because that is really the most important thing. There's a story, an old story, that goes like this. There was a man walking among the forest one day. And when he was walking, he happened upon a leprechaun. And when he found this leprechaun, he was excited because he knew that leprechauns like to hide their little pots of gold. And so he cornered the leprechaun to where he couldn't get away and began to kind of shake him down a little bit and say, "Where's your pot of gold? I want it." And the leprechaun finally realized that there was nothing he could do. And so he told the man, he said, "Okay, I'll tell you." And he took him to a specific tree in the forest, and he said, "Okay, under this tree is buried my pot of gold." And the man made him promise that this was the tree. And the leprechaun relented and said, "Yes, I promise this is the one." And then the man was excited, but he realized something, and that was that he had nothing with which to dig. And so he thought about it for a while, and he thought about it, and he finally said, "Okay, here's what I'm going to do, you little leprechaun." He took a handkerchief from his back pocket, and he tied it to a branch on that tree, and once again made that leprechaun promise that he wouldn't move the pot of gold and that he wouldn't move the handkerchief. And the leprechaun promised and said, "Fine, I'll do what you want. I won't move the gold. I won't move the handkerchief." And the man was excited, so he ran home and got his shovel, and he was ready to dig up the pot of gold, and he ran back to the leprechaun. And when he got there, he was devastated. You see, the leprechaun had kept his promise. He had not moved the pot of gold. He had not moved the handkerchief, but he had done something else entirely. The leprechaun had gone, and he had tied a handkerchief to every other tree in the forest. And so when everything is important, nothing is important. And that is a lesson that Jesus is trying to teach the church in Ephesus. When everything is important, nothing is important. When a handkerchief is tied to every tree, there is no unique tree where the pot of gold is buried. And that is the lesson that they are being taught today. And maybe that is the lesson that you are being taught today. There are many different things that go on in a church. We have many gifts. We, as a church, have many things that we're good at. Your church specifically might be morally good. They might give tithe and offering. They might have good sermons. They might give to the poor and the needy. They might have great ministries, a great children's ministry, youth ministry, young adult ministry. They might be doing well in so many different ways. But the truth is, as important as many of those things are, they don't matter if you have become so legalistic and cold that you have taken the joy out of following Christ. And that is the exact thing that is being talked about in this letter, in this short letter to the Ephesians in the book of Revelation. Jesus is saying, listen, you have done oh so well. You've kept the rules I've laid out. You have kept away the false prophets, the evildoers, the wrong doctrines. You are doing things right by the letter of the law. But you have lost the most important thing, he says. He says, you have forgotten how to love. And that is not good, because that is the most important thing. And he's saying, remember what that was like when you first began to follow me. But don't only remember, repent of what you are doing today and what you are doing now. But don't only repent, return to the way you used to do things. Don't tie a handkerchief to every single tree, because when everything is important, nothing is important. Remember what's important. Repent of your ways and return to doing what you were doing. Love everybody. It doesn't matter who they are or what they've done or how they act or where they come from. Love them all, period. Then everything else will follow. Don't stop following the rules. Don't stop doing good things. But understand that those things are less important than love. They're still important, but when they are compared to love, I suppose you could say they might be a little peripheral. So remember that, says Jesus. Thank you so much for joining us today on Creating Disciples. We hope you come back next time for another message. Have a wonderful and blessed day.